Thanks. Margaret was so nice to read from my article, so I would like to begin by reading from yours. In the study, which really was widely circulated, at least in my little orbit, you said that currently available technology, tech automation, can replace 45% of activities people are paid to perform. What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, I think it's worthwhile unpacking that a little bit because it sounds like there'd be 45% unemployment tomorrow. First of all, I think the one thing that we looked at first was we think that the right level of analysis is not simply an occupation. Because we think it's actually quite rare that you'll be able to take someone out of a role and just put a robot in there or put an artificial intelligence algorithm and it will do everything that that person used to do in their job. So we looked at things at the level of individual activities. So rather than jobs, activities. And we looked at every activity that the Bureau of Labor Statistics actually catalogs, which is about 2,000 of them. For each of those, we broke it into 18 different capabilities which potentially could be automated. So everything from fine motor skills, navigating in the physical world, but also cognitive things like recognizing known patterns, generating novel patterns, even things like recognizing human emotions or producing natural language or understanding speech. And for each of those, we understood for each activity what level of capability you needed in order to perform that activity, and then what the current level of technology was for each of those capabilities. So how good computers are at understanding spoken language, how good robots are at moving in the physical world, et cetera. And so when you compare all those things, you discover that about 45% of the activities people do could potentially be automated by adapting currently demonstrated technologies. So you can't buy this technology off the shelf yet. And so it's a theoretical potential based on technology which already exists.
So let's put me out of work, right? I can imagine we already have technology that, for example, with a baseball game, not to put too fine a point on it, you can have a technology that can look at the box score, can say, here is how Lester pitched, here's how Corbett pitched, and then essentially write an article like one used to read in the Tribune, in the Sun-Times, that essentially writes up the game. But a computer couldn't necessarily, or currently available technology, couldn't write the sports columnist's take on it that sort of uses human emotion and personal opinion making. And so that's sort of the thing you're talking about in terms of replacing journalism. It can replace certain tasks, but maybe not entire people.
That's exactly right. In fact, there's a company here in Chicago which famously has an algorithm that will take the box score and then write a sports story. We'll take a securities filing, the transcript of an earnings call, and write a financial news report. So certain types of journalism already arguably can be automated. It's being done for Little League games, et cetera. But then more investigative, quote, long-form pieces, more difficult to do.
Right. I think earnings, for example, you can automate the writing up of an earnings just because you look at that report and it's pretty easy to see, okay, here's where income is, here's where earnings are, here's earnings per share. We can just put this together. Not to bore people too quickly because it's so early in the morning, but I am personally very interested in methodology. And when I see numbers like this, 45% of occupations can be automated, what always occurs to me is, how do you know that? So how do you know that?
To be honest, it's an estimate. So we take that with some humility. But again, taking things at a very fine-grained level, both in terms of the number of activities we examined, as well as each of these different capabilities, and then trying to be as comprehensive as possible in terms of the technology we've identified. It turns out that if you do a large number of smaller estimates, you're more likely to have a reasonable total than if you just try to take a big estimate. That being said, we believe there are big error bars around all of the estimates that we're doing. And right now we're trying to understand, I said it won't happen tomorrow. How long will it take for some of these changes to happen? And when we think about some of the things that have to happen, you actually have to integrate all these capabilities to create a solution that could do something that, an activity that already occurs, whether it's driving or journalism or scientific research. And then you have to adapt that for an individual circumstance. So, in a journalist case, it'd be, what's the beat, and what are the stories you want to cover. That takes some time as well. And then adoption of any technology we found in history usually takes a decade or two. Mm-hmm. And so I think, this is unpublished research. We're working on it now. I agree with this idea that we ought to be thinking and working on these things now. I don't think there's a luxury of time, but actually if you look at the time scales for this to be, these types of technologies to be adopted, we are talking decades. So, a work generation or two. That being said, the impact could be quite large during that time period. And for an individual worker, it could come very quickly. Right. But on a macro level, it might, we should be aware that it could take decades for some of these technologies to move.
I think for a lot of people, the most obvious technology that's coming down the pike right now is the development of self-driving cars. You have car manufacturers that are working on this, like Toyota. You have tech companies that are working on this, like Google. And then interestingly, you have tech service companies that don't do hardware at all, like Uber, that are also working on this. Speaking of time horizons, when should people in this room expect to be able to walk out the door, press the Uber Lyft button, and a car comes up without a driver? And they can expect that when the car comes up, there won't be a human in the front seat.
I don't know, is the quick answer.
It's so disappointing.
That being said, I live in San Francisco, and I see self-driving cars on the streets now. Now, they do have a driver sitting there ready to take over when it's necessary. But I think one thing to note is here in the United States, for instance, we basically have saturation in terms of the number of vehicles that exist here. And most of us keep our cars for several years at least. And so the time it would take for all cars to become self-driving is going to be, it takes some time as a result. But as you said, there are some fleets, for instance, which could turn over much more rapidly.
Right. Fleets essentially so that Uber and Lyft or even a municipal sort of taxi ordinance could essentially say, we're just going to buy 5,000 of these automated vehicles all at once. And so it's not like all these different Americans making a decision to buy a car after 3 years or 5 years.
That's right.
And there it would happen faster.
Absolutely, and we're finding the auto manufacturers now starting to get in the mobility services field as well.
Right. It's interesting because I feel like in sort of the grand sweep of history and workers and technological change, there's what I sometimes call the we used to story. We used to be farmers, and then we moved into factories. And we used to be manufacturers, and now we're really a nation of service workers. What is the next we used to? In 20 years, what will people say, well, we used to do this, but now we don't?
Yeah, well, it's great humility. I don't know. I mean, it would be great if we say we used to work, and now we're just in leisure all the time.
Right. We used to work would be something. Yeah.
Which is a story people have told, right? I mean, as you know, the work week has decreased, since the Industrial Revolution. It was very, very high to about 40 hours a week. And it stayed there for, half a century or so, right? And so you could ask the question, shouldn't we all work a little less? We haven't been able to do that here in America. But,
right, and some countries do. I mean, if you look at, a lot of European countries have essentially taken technology and said, well, if the machines plus me can do all this work, then I'll beat French and just take, 7 weeks of vacation. And Americans don't for whatever reason. Maybe do you think it's our culture, our laws, sort of just historical path dependence? Do you have a theory for why Americans?
I don't have a single theory, but I think all those things affect it, right? I mean, I think there's a culture and a tradition, in this country, but we also support that with our laws, and we are the most productive country compared to many others in the world. So we apparently value that as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
But asking about what we can say we used to do, there are 3 broad categories of activities which we found to be much more automatable than others. And they fit in the categories of physical activities in predictable environments. Those are factory work, for instance, but also work on farms fits in that category. And then there are 2 other categories which are more cognitive, which are collecting data and analyzing data. And I think the other point to note there is, we talk about what the impact of these technologies might be on low-wage, low-skill labor. And we absolutely think there's a lot that can happen. There's a lot of high-wage, high-skill work that's being done, particularly collecting data and analyzing data. And so this affects not only low-wage, low-skill, but in fact, some of the more high-paid, more high-skill activities that we pay people to do too.
Well, and the first, a light has come on. The first thing that I thought of and wrote down when you mentioned collecting data and analyzing data, something like radiology, which I think a lot of doctors are already beginning to think, couldn't machines do this job just as efficiently? But then I got a little nervous, Michael, because I thought that isn't your job very much the collection and analysis of data? To what extent can jobs that, or certain activities within your group of workers, to what extent do you think that could be automated in the next 10 years?
Yeah, shout out to my freshman dorm. I was voted the most likely to be replaced by a robot of my own making. Again, activities literally of we're paying MBAs, PhDs, et cetera, to collect data and analyze data. And so if we're able to automate that activities, in the best case, that time can be freed up for higher value uses. And by the way, higher value use might be leisure, but it might be being able to come up with better insights, being able to interpret, being able to interact with others or manage others, a bunch of things which we find more difficult to automate. So, I think all of those things are open up. Yeah.
I should say, I do think your job is safe.
Well, thank you.
I'm interested to sort of take the other side of the coin. What jobs do we think are sort of insulated from technological change? If on the one hand you have routine physical labor, farmers and factory workers, which have already sort of borne the brunt of automation, and sort of next up in the wave is data collection, data analysis. What is, like the Topeka, like so inland from like the tsunami that it's not, if it's going to be touched, it means that the entire country's underwater.
So I'm pretty sure Topeka will be affected as well. But again, I'll come back to my first point. I think the important thing is to look at the level of activities rather than jobs. Mm-hmm. And so there are activities such as managing and coaching others, interacting with people on an emotional level. Right now, physical activities in unpredictable environments are more difficult to automate, although technology is moving rapidly in that area as well. And so again, if you look at a number of those categories, in many cases, those fall in caring professions. Mm-hmm. And so there's a question about what the wage rate is in some of those professions. But some of them are also activities that managers do as well, and executives. So I think thinking through what the activities are. And then what we likely will find is, when you think about a business process, it's unlikely you'll just drop machines into the things that are most automatable. You'll rethink the entire process. And therefore, what that means is almost everyone's job will change. A CEO, we think 20 to 30% of their activities can be automated as well. And so you'll need to rethink entire processes to figure out what it is that we no longer need to do, what it is that people will do, what it is that machines will do. And you could see real reconfiguration. Now, what that will mean is people will have to change the way they think about what they do drastically, which is difficult for us to do, but very important to do.
It's really interesting. I had another question that I wanted to ask, but I'm going to spend a little more time on this piece, particularly with CEOs, because again, we think of the highest paid people, the C-suite, as being completely insulated from a lot of this stuff. But two things. First of all, they haven't been insulated from changes that have already happened. This sort of word processing revolution makes it easier for them to write, for them to collect data, analyze it, put it together on Excel. They don't need as many assistants potentially because you have calendar technology. But at the same time, you still, it seems to my mind, have just as many CEOs, and in fact, they're being paid more than ever, at least as a share of the average worker's wage. So what are some of the changes, with humility, some of the changes that we could expect to see if more of the chief executive's job could be automated?
So hopefully what will happen is they'll spend more time doing things which are impactful in terms of coaching other people, leading other people, helping to make the organization make the decisions that they need to, rather than other things like calendaring, scheduling, producing reports, a bunch of activities which, again, we think are more automatable. I don't have a comment on the current wage levels of CEOs.
Okay, that's all right. For people who don't think that technology is going to displace a lot of work, it seems to me that they point to several data points. One is that in a world where technology is replacing a lot of workers, you would expect productivity growth to be really fantastic. And it's not fantastic at all right now. Productivity growth has been pretty slow for the last few years. And very recently, there was a census report that looked at wage growth throughout the US economy and found that wages actually seem to be growing fastest among the lowest income workers, who also, I think, are probably those first in line for technological displacement. So with low productivity and wage growth among low-income workers, does this challenge the theory that technology is nipping at the workers' or activities' heels right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a great economic mystery about what's going on with productivity, given we have all these technologies. And in fact, productivity growth has not only slowed, it's been negative for the past couple of quarters in this country, which is really scary. In fact, I don't want to scare people, but if you look at economic growth in, call it the G19 plus Nigeria, the biggest economies in the world over the past 50 years, it's been roughly 3.5%. About half of that has come from increases in the labor force. Our population's growing, more women in the workforce, all great stuff. And about half of it from productivity growth, producing more for the same amount of labor in. What's going to happen in most of these countries is that labor force growth is going to drop off the table. It's already negative in Japan. It'll be negative in China in about half a decade. And so half of the sources of our economic growth are about to disappear. Mm-hmm. And so while we're worried about robots causing mass unemployment, we might need these machines just to make sure that we have enough growth that our children have better lives than we do. Right. And so that's a different way I think about thinking about it. But the productivity growth question, what's happening now, it is a mystery to a lot of people. There are parts of the theory which are about there's a lag between technology being developed and all of the things that happen in the economy to allow productivity growth to occur. We saw that in the 80s to the 90s with computers and PCs and networks and mainframes, and then finally we saw the acceleration, Bob Solow's paradox. Mm-hmm. There are questions about measurement. There's a bunch of stuff that we get out of technology that we never pay for, and it doesn't show up in GDP, and yet my life is better because Google Maps, got me here faster, and I don't pay for internet search and all those sorts of things. So again, that consumer surplus doesn't get measured. But when you add all those things up, it doesn't seem like it's enough yet, and so it's still a mystery. I'm hopeful that it's partly just lag.
We have about 70 seconds left, and I have two enormous questions that I'm going to make you reduce the answers to essentially like a tweet-sized answer. The first question was going to be, what should a 20-year-old understanding these changes coming down the pike in college do right now to prepare his or herself for this future? And the second is, do you agree with the idea that government should be more aggressively looking at either portable or nationalized benefits like universal health care, universal basic income, in order to protect against the possibility of workers being displaced?
In reverse order, yes. And then the 20-year-old.
Very good. Still 23 seconds.
Yeah, the 20-year-old, mostly I think the most important thing is the meta skills around flexibility, learning how to learn, resilience, all those things. In the medium term, for those who are so inclined, understanding data better. I joke we should teach more statistics and less calculus, because everyone needs to learn how to deal with dirty, difficult, large amounts of data is extremely powerful.
Fabulous. Thank you, Michael.
Great. Thank you.